Welcome back to Sarah History. Today we are going to talk about something that seems, on the surface, almost embarrassingly small as a cause for one of the greatest transformations in human history. We are going to talk about pepper. Black pepper. The kind sitting in a shaker on your kitchen table right now, so ordinary that you probably never think about it. So cheap that you use it without measuring. So available that you have likely thrown some away when a bottle went stale. In 1400, a pound of black pepper was worth more than a laborer earned in a week. In the markets of Venice and Genoa, spices from the East, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, were traded with the same intensity and speculation that oil and gold are traded today. The man who controlled the spice routes controlled the wealth of the known world. And the men who could not access those routes began looking for new ones. What they found when they looked was not just a sea route to Asia. It was the Americas. It was Africa. It was the Pacific. It was the entire shape of the modern world, drawn in the wake of ships that sailed into waters no European had ever entered, guided by instruments they barely understood, funded by monarchs gambling their treasuries on the chance that the earth was round and the Indies were reachable. We call it the Age of Exploration. It was also the Age of Conquest, the Age of Slavery, the Age of Epidemic. And it was, without question, the event horizon beyond which the ancient world became the modern one. This is the story of how the desire for spice rewired the entire planet. Let us begin with the problem. Part 1. The Problem of the East. In the early 15th century, the trade between Europe and Asia was one of the most profitable enterprises in the known world, and almost all of it was controlled by people who were not Western Europeans. The Overland Silk Road, as we discussed in Episode 6, had been disrupted by the collapse of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Turks, who had taken Constantinople in 1453 and now controlled the primary land routes between Europe and Asia. Every spice that traveled from India or Southeast Asia to a European kitchen passed through Ottoman-controlled territory and paid Ottoman tolls. Then it passed through Venetian or Genoese merchants who added their own enormous markups. By the time a bag of nutmeg reached a market in London or Paris, it had changed hands a dozen times and cost a small fortune. This was not just an inconvenience. It was a structural economic problem for the kingdoms of Western Europe, particularly Portugal and Spain, which sat on the far western edge of the continent, far from the established Venetian-Ottoman trade networks, and were therefore at the greatest disadvantage. They were paying maximum prices for Eastern goods while having minimum influence over the routes that produced them. The question that began obsessing certain European minds in the early 15th century was deceptively simple. Was there another way to get there? The earth, educated Europeans knew, was round. Aristotle had argued it. The ancient Greek mathematician Eratosthenes had calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy in 240 BC. Medieval European scholars had never seriously believed the earth was flat. That is a myth invented in the 19th century. What they did not know was how large the earth was and what lay in the unknown oceans to the west and south. The nation that answered that question first would break the Venetian-Ottoman stranglehold on Eastern trade and potentially become the wealthiest kingdom in the world. Portugal decided to answer it first. Part 2. The School of the Sea. The man who started it all was not himself an explorer. He never sailed to Africa or Asia or anywhere particularly distant. He sat on a promontory at the southwestern tip of Portugal, at a place called Sagres, and he thought. He gathered information. He funded expeditions. He assembled the greatest collection of navigational knowledge in Europe. And his name was Henry, Prince Henry of Portugal, known to history as Henry the Navigator. Henry was the third son of King João I of Portugal, born in 1394. He had fought in the Portuguese conquest of Ceuta in North Africa in 1415 and had been struck by what he learned there about the gold and spice trade that came north across the Sahara Desert. The goods of sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian Ocean were reaching the Mediterranean through Muslim intermediaries. Henry became convinced that Portugal could access those goods directly by sailing south along the African coast, bypassing the intermediaries entirely. At Sagres, he established what historians often call a school of navigation, though it was less a formal school than a continuous research operation. He gathered cartographers, astronomers, mathematicians, and experienced sailors from across Europe and the Mediterranean. He collected maps. He funded the development of a new kind of ship, the caravel, smaller, more maneuverable, capable of sailing closer to the wind than any previous European vessel, designed specifically for coastal exploration along an unfamiliar shore. And year after year, he sent ships south along the African coast. The early expeditions were modest, reaching the Canary Islands, Madeira, the Azores. Then, in 1434, one of Henry's captains, Gil Eanes, accomplished something that sounds trivial but was, at the time, a genuine act of courage. He sailed past Cape Bojador, a headland on the western coast of Africa that had defeated 15 previous Portuguese expeditions. Cape Bojador was not particularly dangerous physically, but it had become, in the imaginations of European sailors, the edge of the world. The waters beyond were believed to be boiling, full of sea monsters, impossible to navigate. Sailors who passed it would never return. Henry had sent Eanes 14 times before he finally made it past the Cape and sailed on into the perfectly ordinary waters on the other side. Cape Bojador was a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. Breaking through it opened the entire west coast of Africa to Portuguese exploration. Over the next decades, Portuguese ships pushed further and further south, mapping a coastline that no European had ever seen, trading gold and ivory and, tragically, beginning the practice of capturing Africans to sell as enslaved people, the first stirrings of the Atlantic slave trade that would become one of the defining catastrophes of the modern era. Henry died in 1460 without seeing his ships reach India. But he had built the foundation on which everything that followed would stand. Part 3. The Cape and the Route. In 1487, a Portuguese captain named Bartolomeu Dias set out from Lisbon with 3 ships and a mission. He was to sail as far south along the African coast as possible and find, if it existed, the southern tip of Africa. If Africa had a southern tip that could be rounded, then the sea route to India was real. What happened to Dias is one of the great stories of navigation. He sailed south, further than any European had gone. Then a storm struck, a massive weeks-long storm that drove his ships far to the south and west, out of sight of land entirely. When the storm finally passed and Dias turned north, looking for the African coast, he found nothing. He kept sailing north. Still nothing. Then he turned east, and there was the coast of Africa, but the coast was running east-west, not north-south. He had been blown around the Cape without seeing it. Africa had been circumnavigated accidentally. He turned south to find the Cape he had missed and named it the Cape of Storms, a name that reflected the experience perfectly. When he returned to Portugal, King João II renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, because it represented exactly that, the hope of a sea route to India. 10 years later, in 1497, a Portuguese captain named Vasco da Gama set out to complete what Dias had proved was possible. He sailed with 4 ships, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, sailed up the east coast of Africa, where he found sophisticated Muslim trading cities that were already part of the Indian Ocean trade network, hired a Gujarati pilot named Ahmad ibn Majid who knew the monsoon routes of the Indian Ocean, and in May 1498 arrived on the Malabar coast of India at the city of Calicut. He had found the sea route. After decades of effort, uncountable money, and lives lost at sea, Portugal had broken the monopoly. The ships returned to Lisbon loaded with spices. The profit on the cargo was 60 times the cost of the entire voyage. The age of exploration had found its proof of concept. And on the other side of the world, a Genoese sailor who had been watching all of this with furious impatience was about to pursue a completely different solution to the same problem. Part 4. The Admiral of the Ocean Sea. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa around 1451. He was a sailor from his youth, experienced in Atlantic waters, and by the 1480s he had developed a theory that was both brilliantly conceived and badly calculated. His theory was correct in principle. The Earth is round, therefore sailing west from Europe should eventually reach Asia. His calculation of the Earth size was wrong, significantly wrong. Columbus believed the Earth was much smaller than it actually is, and that Asia was much closer to Europe than it actually is. If the Americas had not existed, his fleet would have run out of food and water in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and everyone aboard would have died. But the Americas do exist. And on August 3, 1492, Columbus sailed from Palos de la Frontera in Spain with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, funded by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Castile and Aragon, who had just completed the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to reclaim Spain from Muslim rule, and were in the mood for ambitious ventures. The voyage west took 33 days. On the morning of October 12, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana spotted land. Columbus landed on an island in the Bahamas and called it San Salvador. He encountered the Taino people, who greeted him with warmth and generosity. He noted in his journal that they would make good servants. He took several of them captive before he left. Columbus made 4 voyages to the Americas. He never accepted that he had found a new continent. He insisted until his death that he had reached Asia, the Indies, which is why the people he encountered are still called Indians in many languages today, an error of identification encoded permanently into the vocabulary. He died in 1506, stripped of the titles and privileges he had been promised, bitter, sick, and genuinely confused about what he had found. The man who gave the new continents their name was an Italian navigator named Amerigo Vespucci, who made voyages to the South American coast in 1499 and 1502 and was the first to clearly argue, in published letters widely read across Europe, that this was not Asia but an entirely new landmass, a mundus novus, a new world. A German cartographer named Martin Wald C. Muller, making a new world map in 1507, labeled the southern continent America after Amerigo. The name stuck. Part 5. The world turned upside down. What followed the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama was the most rapid and violent transformation of the human world in recorded history. In 1519, a Spanish conquistador named Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico with approximately 500 soldiers, 16 horses, and 14 cannons. 3 years later, the Aztec Empire, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, with a capital city, Tenochtitlan, larger than any city in Europe at the time, was destroyed. Its emperor, Moctezuma II, was dead. Its temples were rubble. Its gold and treasures were on their way to Spain. How did 500 men destroy an empire of millions? The answer is not primarily military genius, though Cortés was a capable tactician. The answer is disease. The peoples of the Americas had been isolated from the Old World for roughly 15,000 years. They had no immunity to the diseases that Europeans, Africans, and Asians had been living with and dying from for millennia. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, these diseases swept through American populations ahead of the European armies, sometimes reaching communities that had never even seen a European. Estimates of the population decline in the Americas following European contact range from 50 to 90%. Some historians call it the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history, larger in proportional terms even than the Black Death in Europe. In Mexico alone, the population may have fallen from 25 million in 1519 to 1 million by 1600. The Aztec capital Tenochtitlan was rebuilt as Mexico City. The Inca Empire of South America, even larger and more complex than the Aztec, was conquered by Francisco Pizarro with an even smaller force in the 1530s, using the same combination of disease, horses, steel weapons, and the exploitation of internal divisions that had served Cortés in Mexico. The silver of the Americas began flowing to Spain in quantities that had no precedent in history. The mines of Potosí in modern Bolivia produced more silver in the 16th century than the rest of the world combined. This silver paid for Spanish armies, Spanish fleets, and Spanish dominance over European politics for a century. It also caused inflation across Europe, too much silver chasing too few goods, which disrupted economies from London to Constantinople. The silver of America was so abundant that it devalued silver globally and contributed to economic crises in Ming China, which depended on silver as its primary currency. The Portuguese, meanwhile, were building a trading empire across the Indian Ocean. They established fortified trading posts, called Vitórias, at Goa on the Indian coast, at Malacca controlling the straits between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, at Hormuz controlling the entrance to the Persian Gulf, at Mozambique and other points along the African coast. They did not conquer inland territories as the Spanish did in the Americas. They controlled the sea lanes, charging tolls, attacking ships that refused to buy Portuguese trading licenses, using their naval gunpowder advantage to enforce a trading monopoly on waters where Arab and Indian and Chinese merchants had traded freely for centuries. Then, in 1519, a Portuguese navigator in Spanish service named Ferdinand Magellan set out to do what Columbus had intended and failed to do, reach Asia by sailing west. He sailed south through the Americas, found the strait at the southern tip that bears his name today, crossed the Pacific, a journey of 99 days without sight of land, during which his crew ate rats and boiled leather to survive, and reached the Philippines. Magellan was killed in a battle there. But one of his 5 ships, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, continued west, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and arrived back in Spain in September 1522 with 18 surviving crew members out of the original 270. The Earth had been circumnavigated. The shape of the world was confirmed. It was round. It was connected. And it was, from this moment forward, irrevocably and permanently a single system: political, economic, biological, and cultural. Part 6. The Columbian Exchange. The transformation that followed European contact between the hemispheres is called the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the Old World and the New, in both directions. From the Americas to Europe came plants that would transform the Old World's diet and agriculture permanently. The potato, brought from the Andes to Europe in the 16th century, became the primary caloric staple for much of northern and central Europe, enabling population growth that the previous grain-based diet could not have sustained. The Irish famine of the 1840s was caused by a potato blight, which tells you how completely the potato had been adopted in less than 3 centuries. Tomatoes arrived in Europe from Mexico and became so fundamental to Italian cuisine that it is almost impossible to imagine that pasta and pizza existed without them for most of Italian history. They did. Maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts, cacao, vanilla, chili peppers, tobacco, rubber, all of these traveled from the Americas to the rest of the world. The diets of Europe, Asia, and Africa were completely restructured by American crops within a few generations. From the Old World to the Americas went wheat, rice, sugarcane, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and the diseases. The horse transformed the cultures of the North American plains. Peoples like the Lakota and Comanche, who had been foot hunters, became some of the most effective cavalry warriors in the world within a few generations of acquiring the horse. Sugarcane planted in the Caribbean and Brazil required vast amounts of labor, which the dying American populations could not provide, which drove the Atlantic slave trade, the forced transportation of roughly 12.5 million Africans to the Americas over 3.5 centuries, one of the greatest crimes in human history. The Columbian Exchange connected what had been 2 separate biological systems for 15,000 years. The consequences, in population dynamics, in agriculture, in disease, in economics, in culture, are still playing out today. Part 7. The Costs. I have been telling this story with a kind of forward momentum, the ships sailing, the routes opening, the world connecting. That momentum is real, and the connections were real, and the transformation was real. But I need to stop here and be honest about the costs. Because the age of exploration was also the age of atrocity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were not discovered. They were living there, in communities ranging from small bands of hunters to vast urban empires, and they were, within a few generations of European contact, overwhelmingly dead. Not from conquest alone. From disease overwhelmingly, but disease accompanied by conquest, enslavement, forced labor, and systematic destruction of their cultures, languages, and religious practices. The survivors were enslaved, converted by force, taxed to death, worked in mines until they died, and stripped of the land their ancestors had lived on for thousands of years. The Atlantic slave trade, built to replace the dying American labor force on sugar and tobacco and cotton plantations, was an industrial system of human kidnapping, imprisonment, and transportation that operated for 350 years and involved the forced removal of over 12 million people from their homes in Africa. The Middle Passage, the journey across the Atlantic in the holds of slave ships, killed roughly 2 million of those 12 million people in transit. Those who survived arrived in a world where they were property, where their children were property, where every aspect of their humanity was legally denied. The profits from this system, from the slave trade itself, from the plantation economy it powered, from the cotton and sugar and tobacco that flowed into European and American markets, funded the Industrial Revolution, built the great banking houses of London and Amsterdam, endowed the universities, filled the museums. The modern Western world was built on this foundation as surely as it was built on the intellectual achievements of the Enlightenment. These are not separate stories. They are the same story. The same age of exploration that gave us the circumnavigation of the earth, the connection of the hemispheres, the Columbian Exchange, the potato and the tomato, and the beginnings of the global economy, also gave us the near extinction of the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the Atlantic slave trade. The wonder and the horror are not separable. They are 2 faces of the same event. Part 8. Why it still matters. The age of exploration ended the world as it had existed since human beings first spread across the earth. For 15,000 years, the Americas had been separate from the Old World. For thousands of years, Sub-Saharan Africa had been largely isolated from Europe's economic systems. The Pacific Islands were unknown to anyone outside their own networks. In the space of roughly a century, from 1488 to 1522, from Bartolomeu Dias rounding the Cape to Elcano completing Magellan's circumnavigation, all of that separateness ended permanently. Every political, economic, and cultural system in the world that exists today exists in a world shaped by those voyages. The nations of North and South America exist because of those voyages. The modern African-American population exists because of the slave trade those voyages enabled. The global food system that feeds 8 billion people depends on crops that were unknown outside the Americas before 1492. The capitalism that organizes the global economy developed its modern form in the colonial trading empires those voyages created. The inequalities between nations that define global politics today have roots in the extraction of wealth from colonized peoples that began with those voyages. And it all began with pepper, with the desire of European merchants to stop paying Ottoman tolls on Asian spices, with the ambition of a Portuguese prince sitting on a wind-swept promontory at the edge of Europe, sending ships south into waters no European had charted. The smallness of the origin against the enormity of the consequence is one of the recurring themes of this podcast. A flea carrying a bacterium rewrote Europe. A prince obsessed with spice routes rewrote the world. The ships that sailed out of Lisbon and Palos and the other ports of the Iberian Peninsula in the 15th and 16th centuries did not know what they were beginning. They were looking for pepper. They found a planet. And everything that happened after, the good and the catastrophic and the complex and the irreversible, everything followed from those first sails catching the wind and carrying men into the unknown. Closing. I want to end with Rodrigo da Triana, the sailor on the Pinta who spotted land on October 12, 1492, and called out to wake the crew. The man who was, as far as we know, the first European to see the Americas from the sea. He received no reward for it. Columbus, who had promised a lifetime pension to whoever first spotted land, claimed the reward for himself on the grounds that he had seen a light the night before, an account that most historians treat with deep skepticism. Rodrigo da Triana gave one cry in the dark and the world changed. And then he was brushed aside by the man who took credit. History is full of moments like that. The ordinary person who does the thing that matters and gets nothing for it. The person in the hold of the ship, doing the sailing, while someone else gets the monument and the continent named after them. But that cry in the dark, whatever its consequences, however mixed and terrible and transformative, that cry changed the shape of the human world more decisively than almost any other single moment in recorded history. He called out, and we are all still living in the echo of it. This has been Sarah History, Episode 8. Thank you for being here.